Is it the smart strategy to draft best player available, or even kind of more simply put, is it the best strategy to simply just draft the player that most people think is going to be the best player available? So, for example, should you just draft whoever is the highest on the consensus draft board? Well, probably not, right? It's usually a lot more complex than that, but I want to kind of put it to the test. So what I did was I picked 5 teams that have had kind of a history of maybe not being the best drafting teams these past several years. So the Browns, Giants, Lions, Panthers, and Jets are the 5 teams that we're going to talk about. I'm simply going to go back and look at the past 6 years and say if every first round pick they instead simply drafted best player available, would they be better off or worse off? Kind of a fun exercise. I did this with the Raiders earlier, and they would have been way better off had they drafted best player available. They would have had like a super team instead of having a bunch of bust on their team. But I wanted to see if that's the case with every team or if that's just the Raiders were kind of a unique case. So let's get into it. First things first, the Cleveland Browns here. So we're going to see some, repeats. Greg Newsome. So the column on the left, that's who they drafted. Column on the right would be who they would have drafted instead. Greg Newsome is someone who, there's an asterisk next to Greg Newsome's name, and that's simply because technically it would have been Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah who they would have drafted instead, but I decided since they ended up with both anyways, we'll just keep it the same. But you could write JOK there instead. That might be more fair, but we're just going to call it even, I decided. But again, you could go either way. The rest of it, though, Jedrick Wills or Jerry Jeudy, I think Jerry Jeudy's probably maybe slightly better, but maybe not. I mean, they're both equally good. To me, that feels like a push. Instead of Baker Mayfield, actually, it surprised me, but Saquon Barkley was number 1 on the consensus big board that season, which I don't know why a running back was number 1, but it was a different time, even just a few years ago. That being said, I do think that, I almost feel like, so Baker Mayfield helped them more in those first few years, but I guess the flip side is they're currently paying Baker Mayfield to not play for them, so having Saquon Barkley would have, I guess, helped them a little bit, but that's kind of a weird scenario, so, I don't know. Denzel Ward, they drafted with the 4th overall pick that year. Instead, the consensus big board would have had them drafting Bradley Chubb, who I like as well, but I would probably say Ward is the more valuable asset out of those two. Myles Garrett would have been the same either way. They drafted him 1st overall. He was number 1 on the consensus big board, and he's been great. So there you go. Instead of Jabril Peppers, they would have had Reuben Foster, which I feel like is a loss, even though they used Jabril Peppers along with a 1st-round pick to get Odell Beckham Jr. They would have ended up with Reuben Foster, who is currently not in the NFL, although part of that is due to off-the-field issues on top of that. He did play pretty well when he was out there, so kind of a unique case there. Instead of David Njoku, they would have had Dalvin Cook, so a couple of really good running backs would be the case for this Browns team, and I guess they still would have had Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, so this would be a loaded running back room. And then instead of Corey Coleman, you'd have had Miles Jack. That's definitely an upgrade, although Miles Jack isn't the player now he was in his early years in Jacksonville. But still, would the Browns be better off or worse off if this was the case? I would probably think they'd be worse off. I think that they are probably happy with the way that they drafted, and they actually have drafted pretty decently well. They have a reputation of being a bad drafting team, but that's kind of more so from the pre-Myles Garrett draft, I would probably say. Moving over to the Giants, instead of Kadarius Toney, they would get Kwity Paye, which, as of it stands right now, is probably an upgrade, although the jury is still out on Kadarius Toney. Andrew Thomas has been really good. Derek Brown hasn't quite been as good. They'd probably rather stick with Andrew Thomas. Instead of Daniel Jones, though, you get Josh Allen, who would be an upgrade. And even though I like Dexter Lawrence, I think Montez Sweat has been awesome and probably an upgrade there as well. They would have lost DeAndre Baker and gotten Jawan Taylor. Taylor, would probably still be on the Giants at least, so that's a slight upgrade, but neither one of those are spectacular. Saquon Barkley would have been the same either way. Again, another team that would have ended up with Reuben Foster instead of Evan Ingram, so kind of a no real difference there. And Laramie Tunsil instead of Eli Apple would be the big difference. So, you lose Andrew Thomas, but you get Laramie Tunsil, who can kind of replace them. That kind of ends up being even. You lose Daniel Jones, but you're also getting guys like Josh Allen and Montez Sweat. So I would probably lean towards this would be a benefit to the Giants. I don't think it's a massive benefit, but I do think they would have been better off had they simply just drafted best player available. As for the Lions, they no longer get Penei Sewell. They instead get Justin Fields, who, again, that's kind of an interesting discussion. Who would you rather have? A quarterback with potential, although he hasn't shown a lot of it his rookie year. He still showed flashes, though, so there's hope there. Or would you rather have just the guy who you feel really good is going to be a franchise tackle for them for a while? I don't know. That's an interesting debate. I mean, clearly the Lions picked Sewell, so they felt stronger about him when they did. Jeff Okudah stays the same. He was also someone who was number 1 on the consensus big board, which surprised me. TJ Hawkinson, instead, they would end up with Ed Oliver. Have to imagine they'd rather have Hawkinson. And then you also have, Frank Ragnow instead of him. You get Calvin Ridley, who are both good. I don't know. That feels no clear advantage or disadvantage. Gerard Davis for Reuben Foster. Again, no clear advantage or disadvantage. And then I think they would rather have Taylor Decker than Miles Jack. So for me, I think the Lions are another team that is happy with how they drafted and would rather not go back and draft best player available. As for the Panthers, so they're another team who would end up with Justin Fields over J.C. Horn. That's debatable, very debatable as to what you would rather have. The Panthers clearly chose J.C. Horn, so they'd rather have an elite cornerback, although, Horn looked a lot better as a rookie, but played a lot less, so that's kind of the question mark. Derek Brown would have still been drafted. Instead of Brian Burns, they get Jawan Taylor, which is, I think, a clear downgrade. DJ Moore and Calvin Ridley. DJ Moore will play next season, so I guess I'll give the slight edge to him, but it's not a massive edge. They're both very good. Christian McCaffrey and Marshawn Lattimore. I'd personally much rather have Marshawn Lattimore. As great as McCaffrey is, just the difference between a running back, albeit a running back who does more than just run with the football. McCaffrey's probably one of the most valuable halfbacks when he's healthy, whereas Lattimore maybe isn't the most valuable corner, but just a corner has way more value than even a Christian McCaffrey type halfback. I'd much rather have Lattimore, and then I'd probably rather have Miles Jack as well than Vernon Butler. So did they win or lose? It's a tough one. Let's consider the J.C. Horn versus Fields one a push. So you lose Brian Burns and Christian McCaffrey, but you get Marshawn Lattimore and Miles Jack. That's kind of the trade-off. I think I'd rather have Burns and McCaffrey than Lattimore, probably, even though you could argue either one. I guess we'll just consider this one a push because I do value corners highly, so we'll say this is a tie. Finally, for the Jets, so what's interesting about them is they had 2 first-round picks last year. The 2 that they would have ended up with are actually Zach Wilson and Mac Jones instead of Zach Wilson and Elijah Vera Tucker. Now, you have to imagine they would not draft 2 quarterbacks in the same round. If it's the first round, maybe you draft 2 7th-round quarterbacks, not 2 first-round quarterbacks. If they didn't draft Mac Jones with that next pick, they would have ended up with Kwity Paye. Although I have to say, you kind of would like where the Jets are at if they had Zach Wilson and Mac Jones, right? I mean, Mac Jones kind of the guy who will be solid, and Zach Wilson the guy who has potential to be fantastic. The issue, of course, is there's only one ball. You can't have them both play 17 games, so that's kind of why things would get a little tricky, but that's a fascinating one. And then for the next one, instead of Mekhi Becton, they get Jerry Jeudy. I'd rather have Becton, I think. Quinton Williams stays the same. Instead of Sam Darnold, you get Bradley Chubb. That would certainly feel good. And instead of Jamal Adams, you'd get Marshawn Lattimore, which this is where things get weird because, like, in a vacuum, you'd obviously rather Lattimore than Adams, but Adams got you 2 first-round picks. So maybe that just makes things weird. And then instead of Darren Lee, they would have gotten Miles Jack. Miles Jack was interesting where he was like top 10 on the consensus big board, but went in round 2. So like most people ended up with Miles Jack. But regardless, this is kind of, again, it's I think one where you could argue one way or the other. I think I would lean towards the Jets would like to turn back time and draft best player available. I think I'd rather the column on the right than the column on the left. The big one being Sam Darnold for Bradley Chubb would be very nice, I think. And again, and that's kind of how I'm viewing it. Would you rather have the column on the left or the column on the right? Obviously, the butterfly effect changes things because, if they have Marshawn Lattimore, they probably don't trade him, all of that stuff. So there we go. Kind of a fun exercise. And in conclusion, what have we learned here? So my verdict, personally, was that I felt like out of these 5 teams, 2 of them got better when they went back and they drafted best player available. 2 of them got worse, and 1 was kind of a tie. 1 was debatable. You could argue one way or the other. Reasonable minds can differ. So with that verdict in, what does this tell us? I think what it does tell us is that it's not so simple as just draft whoever's highest on the consensus big board and you'll end up being a good drafting team, because keep in mind, I specifically chose these teams because they've been drafting highly in the draft these past several seasons. That's why I went out and chose them. And typically when you do that, it's because you're not drafting the best players in the first place. So part of like the Giants got better, but part of that was because they made some picks that weren't very good. They picked Eli Apple over Laramie Tunsil. So like, that's a worse pick than a lot of other teams can say that they've made. So that's part of what it is. I think I would probably still stand by. You should trust your evaluation, and you should pay attention to, I think you should pay attention to what other people are saying, pay attention to the consensus draft board and all of that stuff, because the more smart people you have working on something, the closer you're going to get to the correct answer. That's just the reality of the situation. But at the end of the day, I think if you're a good NFL team, you're probably going to be better off, just not ignoring the consensus big board, but trusting your own evaluation, I think is fair to say, which actually surprised me a little bit. I thought that these worser teams would have all gotten better looking at the consensus draft board instead. That's not really what happened. So, and again, part of it might just be the Raiders kept reaching on all their picks, right? These guys didn't really reach on their picks, so some of their picks were the same as the consensus big board, and that's where things get interesting. So don't reach, certainly, but you can draft a little bit differently. That's probably the way that I would view this, as long as you trust your scouting department. That's what I think. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. What are your thoughts on all this? Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.